Today we're going to continue our exploration of experimental literature by talking about multivocal fiction writing. This is sometimes termed polyvocal fiction writing as well. The terms can be used interchangeably, and ultimately they both refer to stories that are told through more than one voice. So there are several different ways that authors do this. And I'm going to talk you through a few different examples, but be mindful that these are not the only examples of ways in which stories have been told through a polyvocal or multivocal perspective. So you may have a situation where a story is being told through different parts of the same character. So the voices are not necessarily distinct individuals in the traditional sense, but rather two different parts of the same person. My favorite example of this is Fight Club by Chuck Palahniuk. There are also situations where different characters might be collectively telling a story about either a common experience or a common theme, and often in these cases, the narrative rotates from character to character in terms of the perspective through which the reader is experiencing the story. One example of this is As I Lay Dying by William Faulkner. In that story, a family is traveling together, and each chapter changes the perspective to a new member of the family, and the novel kind of continues that way, repeating character to character and so on and so forth. Frankenstein is another great example of a story that's told shifting character to character. You might also have a story where the plurality of voices occurs in a way that is not temporally synchronous. And what I mean by that is that you may have voices telling a story that extends across time. So the voices are not necessarily existing during the same time period, or perhaps maybe even on the same in the same place or on the same plane. But nonetheless, they're contributing to the telling of a single unified story. One example of this is The Hours, which is a film adaptation of a Virginia Woolf narrative. And in The Hours, there are three stories sort of happening simultaneously, but they're taking place in different time periods, but nonetheless, they are all kind of unified. And so we're getting three different perspectives or voices, if you will. They're working together across time and space to tell us the story. So as you start thinking about analyzing polyvocal / multivocal fiction, or perhaps even writing some, there's some things that you might consider in terms of getting some ideas going. Some people like to start, if they're considering writing in a multivocal way, how their characters' perspectives within themselves might evolve or change over time. This could be worth considering if you're thinking about writing a story where the character is telling stories or telling a story rather, from different perspectives within themselves. For example, Fight Club is a little bit more of an extreme example, but you might see a story where part of the story is told from the perspective of a character as a child, whereas part of the story is told from the perspective of that same character as an adult. In a case like that, it's helpful to really dig into your character and ask yourself, okay, well, what has changed? Who was the character then? Who are they now? And how are those evolutions going to impact their perspectives and how they would tell a story? There are also, in situations where you're thinking about using multiple individual characters to tell a story, opportunities to consider how each character might perceive what happened, or might perceive the central idea that's driving the story. And again, this is a situation which you really have to consider your characters in an in-depth way. You might start off by considering the practical factors of what information do they have access to, what did they see in experience, what kind of information are they getting secondhand. All of those practical factors are a consideration, but you might also want to consider how who they are intrinsically impacts the way that they see and respond to things happening around them, especially the specific elements of the story that you're telling. Another thing to consider might be ways to develop voice. Are there opportunities to really distinguish the voices, even if you're not using first person narrative? When the voice shifts, how can we distinguish that? This becomes even more challenging when we're dealing with different perspectives within a single character, because we might think of as a single character as having a singular voice, but as we mentioned a few moments ago, there are opportunities to explore different parts of a single character and really think about how those different parts are distinct. And again, I refer back to Fight Club as an excellent example of this. It certainly works on a literal level, but I would argue much more significantly on a symbolic level. So I highly recommend Fight Club if you're really interested in thinking about how a single character might have different perspectives or different elements of who they are that could be used in a multivocal way. Another thing to consider might be distinguishing voices between multiple perspectives when you're genuinely dealing with multiple characters. 34, a poem by Patricia Smith, is a piece of literature that we'll be looking at this week, and that's an excellent example of an author having to give voice to many, many unique perspectives. And she does it very briefly and very subtly, but I think it's a good piece to analyze if you're considering ways to distinguish between different characters and their voices as you're developing their perspectives. Another thing to consider might be how you could approach characters who are experiencing something common across time and or space. If you are writing a story or analyzing a story like The Hours, you have to consider, okay, these characters are experiencing something communal or are reflecting or perceiving something communal, but they're not actually interacting with each other in a conventional way. So you might have to ask yourself, okay, so how might someone deal with the death of a sibling in 2024 in a first world country versus how someone might deal with the death of a sibling in medieval England? There are a lot of things to consider when you're thinking about developing that kind of multivocal piece or even just analyzing it. So I wanted to also give you some examples of polyvocal stories or in monovocal stories, just to help reinforce the distinction between these two types of storytelling. You may have read some of these or be familiar with them to some extent, but if not, I'd encourage you to maybe read up on them, or even read the full novels themselves when you get the chance. I think it's a great way to sort of analyze these strategies in action. So In the monovocal stories, which are stories told through one perspective, I've given you several sort of popular first person narrative novels, with the exception of The Yellow Wallpaper, which is a short story. But for example, in the Hunger Games series, we are experiencing the story through the lens of Katniss Everdeen. That's the perspective that we're getting, and it doesn't really vary. There are also examples of monovocal stories where we're dealing with or non-first person narrative, rather. For example, the Harry Potter series. The Harry Potter series is written in third person narrative, from third person POV, but we're very much experiencing things through the lens of Harry Potter with very few exceptions. So I think that's a good example as well if you're interested in monovocality through a point of view other than first person. Now to get to the polyvocal stories. I have several here that span a wide variety of genres and subject matters. Pulp Fiction is a film. It's a great example not only of polyvocality in storytelling, but also nonlinear storytelling. And I think it's a really great piece of fiction to study as a writer. So I highly recommend that if you haven't seen it, with the caveat that it is fairly violent. So if you're sensitive to that, perhaps skip that one. 19 Minutes by Jodi Picoult is a novel that has a rotating point of view throughout the novel. And many of her novels actually do have rotating point of view. So she's a great author to study in terms of point of view that rotates between multiple characters. As is Gone Girl. Gone Girl is a great example of a novel that uses polyvocality to build suspense and to kind of create twists and plot devices. And then finally, 34, the poem that we'll be reading about Patricia Smith, is a really great example of distinct voices operating within a single story. So my hope is that this will give you a little bit of a foundation for considering multivocal or polyvocal storytelling, both in terms of kind of reading it and understanding how it works, but my hope is that also you'll consider writing some polyvocal fiction of your own as an experiment, because I think it's kind of rewarding and engaging to try out some of these more experimental modes of fiction writing.